Okay, let's start. Number 1. The Sumerian King List. You're inside the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in 1922. Under preservation glass, a four-sided clay column, roughly 8 inches tall, sits in a temperature-controlled case. It arrived in 1913, purchased from a British antiquities dealer who had acquired it in Baghdad from excavations near ancient Nippur. The prism is inscribed on all four faces in tight Sumerian cuneiform. It is catalogued as WBFOURFOURFOURFOUR. Most visitors walk past it. The curators know what it says. Historians have spent a century trying to explain why it says what it says. They still cannot. The Weld-Blundell prism is the most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian king. List a document maintained by Mesopotamian scribes for at least 1,200 years, updated as dynasties rose and fell, treating the kingship of Sumer the way a modern government treats a chain of constitutional succession. It names the cities that held power. It names the kings. It records how long each ruled. For the first 8 entries, the kings who ruled before the Great Flood, the numbers are not human. Here is what the prism actually records. Al-Alam of Eridu, 28,800 years. Al-Algar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. Enmingalana, 28,800 years. Dumazid the Shepherd, 36,000 years. Ensipidsdana, 28,800 years. Enmandarana, 21,000 years. Ubarartutu, 18,600 years. Total reign across 8 pre-flood kings, 241,200 years. Then the text records one sentence. Then the flood swept over. The king list continues on the other side. Jushur of Kish, the first post-flood king, ruled for 1,200 years. Already a fraction. The next, 960 years. The decline has begun. Within a dozen more rulers, the reigns have collapsed to centuries, then decades. Then the historically verifiable kings whose palaces archaeologists have excavated. Here is what historians cannot explain about the format. British Museum Assyriologist Herbert Saggs, publishing in 1962, confirmed that the Sumerian king list uses identical scribble conventions for all entries pre-flood and post-flood alike. Same column headers. Same notation system. Same administrative structure used elsewhere to record grain inventories and temple revenues. Not one editorial note distinguishes the 28,800-year entries from the 30-year entries. Not one. To the scribes who maintained this document for 12 centuries, the 28,800-year reigns and the 30-year reigns were the same category of fact. The mathematics are not mythological. They are deliberate. The pre-flood numbers encode the Sumerian sexagesimal system with precision. 1 sar equals 3,600 years, the Sumerian base unit for large-scale time calculations, derived from their base 60 numerical system. Al-Alam's 28,800 equals exactly 8 sars. Al-Algar's 36,000 equals 10 sars. Enmanluana's 43,200 equals 12 sars. These are not approximations. They are exact multiples of the same base unit. Whoever put these numbers down was calculating. Whoever put these numbers down knew exactly what they were doing. The post-flood decline is not random either. Researcher Thorkild Jacobson at the Oriental Institute, University of Chicago, published in 1939 that the declining trajectory of post-flood reigns follows a consistent mathematical pattern, not literary embellishment. The lengths drop, stabilize, then drop again, in a sequence that reads like a logged biological curve. Something was changing. The scribes were tracking it. What makes this document remarkable beyond the numbers is the framing. The text does not introduce the pre-flood kings as gods. It does not flag their reigns as symbolic. It says the kingship descended from heaven, then lists them with the same administrative detachment it uses for Ur-Nammu, whose palace walls have been excavated. The Sumerians, who also gave the world its first legal code and the 60 base number system every clock still uses, maintained strict distinctions between sacred texts and administrative records. This document is in the administrative category. Something changed at the flood. Before it, 8 beings, 241,200 combined years. After it, the lifespans of rulers collapsed across generations and never recovered. The text records the turning point in one sentence and does not explain it. It does not say what the flood was. It does not say what was different about the world that came after. It simply records that the flood happened, and that everything was smaller on the other side. Who were the 8 kings who ruled before the flood, and why does their mathematics encode the Sumerian base 60 system with such precision? Why does a civilization famous for administrative exactness record predynastic lifespans of 28 procles, 800 years, in the same format it uses for historical kings whose palaces can still be excavated? What mechanism produced the systematic post-flood decline that Jacobson documented? And what swept over, and what did it take when it left? The prism is in Oxford. It has said the same thing for 4,000 years. Number 2. The Turin Royal Canon. You're in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, in 1822. A papyrus that arrived from Egypt in fragments inadequately packed during transport. Its container, apparently jostled loose during the journey from Cairo, is being laid out on a conservation table. The man reassembling it is Jean-François Champollion, the same scholar who cracked the hieroglyphic code that same year using the Rosetta Stone. He recognizes what he is looking at immediately. Not a religious text, not a myth cycle. An administrative document, a king list, written by Egyptian scribes during the reign of Ramesses II around 1200 BCE, naming every ruler Egypt had ever known, in order, with their reign lengths, going back to the very beginning. The beginning is not where Champollion expected to find it. The Turin Royal Canon Papyrus 1874 of the Museo Egizio lists more than 300 Egyptian rulers in chronological sequence, working backward from the historical pharaohs whose names appear on temple walls and obelisks across Egypt. The earlier sections list the rulers of the pre-dynastic period before the First Dynasty in approximately 3100 BCE. And then, above those, the papyrus enters territory unlike anything in the historical record. Rulers the scribes identified as the Hua, the spirits of the dead, and the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus. Here is what those entries record. The followers of Horus ruled for a combined 2,940 years before the first human pharaoh. The spirits of the dead ruled for a combined 13,420 years before them. By the most conservative reconstruction of the surviving columns, divine and semi-divine beings governed Egypt for over 36,000 years before a human being sat on the throne. The scribes who produced this papyrus for Ramesses II listed these divine reigns in the same column format, the same notation system, and the same scribble conventions they used to record Ramesses II's own 37-year reign directly above them. We possess approximately 40% of the original papyrus. 40%. Here is what Egyptologists cannot explain about what remains. Alan Gardner, who published the definitive reconstruction of the Turin Canon in 1959, after decades of analysis, confirmed that the scribes used no special notation to distinguish the pre-dynastic divine entries from the historical ones. No word for myth, no editorial marker, no separate section header identifying the spirits of the dead as a different category of record. To the professional administrators of Ramesses II's court trained scribes who understood the distinction between administrative history and religious narrative, the followers of Horus were historical predecessors. Same document, same format, same weight of evidence. The Turin Canon does not stand alone. Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote Egypt's comprehensive history around 285 BCE for the Greek king Ptolemy II, worked from temple archives that no longer exist. His Egyptiaca surviving only in fragments quoted by the historian Josephus and later by Eusebius independently confirms the same framework. Manetho lists a first dynasty of gods who ruled for thousands of years each, followed by a dynasty of demigods, followed by human pharaohs. His figures for individual divine reigns differ from the Turin Canon in detail, but confirm the same structure. An era of enormously long-lived divine rulers that preceded human-scale governance. Two independent sources, separated by over 9 centuries and drawing from completely different archival traditions, record the same framework. Neither flags it as mythology. Both treat it as administrative history. The papyrus arrived intact in the descriptions given by Bernardino Drovetti, the French consul general who collected it in Egypt in 1820 before inadequate transport packaging took its toll. What arrived in Turin was substantially less complete. What the missing sections contained additional predynastic divine reigns, additional individual reign lengths for the Acu, is recorded nowhere else. The transition visible in the surviving columns is unmistakable. At the row where the last follower of Horus gives way to the first human pharaoh of the first dynasty, the reign lengths change character entirely and permanently. Millennia give way to decades. Centuries give way to years, not gradually. Between one line and the next, the rulers of Egypt stopped living the way they had lived for the previous 36,000 years. The scribes recorded the transition without comment. Something ended. They moved on. Who were the spirits of the dead who governed Egypt for 13,420 combined years? And why does Egypt's own administrative record treat them as direct historical predecessors of Ramesses II, rather than as mythology? Why do Manethos figures in the Turin Canon produced 9 centuries apart from entirely separate archival sources describe the same framework of long-lived pre-human rulers? What did the missing 60% of the papyrus contain? And what ended the age of the followers of Horus and left humans to govern on timescales measured in years rather than millennia? The papyrus fragments are in Turin, in Cairo, and in London. They were whole once. Number 3. The Vedic Puranas. You're inside a manuscript library in Varanasi in 600 BCE. Palm leaf scribes are pressing iron styluses into dried leaves, committing to writing what has been transmitted orally for thousands of years before this moment. What they are recording is not philosophy in the abstract. It is a system mathematical, astronomical, medical, that describes in precise terms what humanity was, what humanity became, and why the transition happened. A physician in the same city will later produce a medical text asking, as its opening clinical question, why people no longer live as long as their ancestors did. Both the cosmic framework and the medical inquiry point to the same event. Something was taken. The 18 major Puranas compiled into written form between 300 BCE and 500 CE, but encoding oral tradition scholars have, traced to the 3rd millennium BCE, and earlier contain the most mathematically precise ancient account of human lifespan reduction anywhere on Earth. The framework is the Yuga system, 4 ages descending in a fixed ratio: the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga, which the texts calculate, began approximately 5,100 years ago, and in which we currently live. Here is what the Bhagavata Purana records for each age. In the Satya Yuga, humans lived 100,000 years. They stood 21 cubits tall, approximately 31 feet. They possessed direct, unmediated access to divine knowledge. In the Treta Yuga, lifespan fell to 10,000 years, height to 14 cubits, divine access became mediated. The Dvapara Yuga, 1,000 years maximum, 7 cubits, divine knowledge accessible only through dedicated practice. The Kali Yuga, 100 to 120 years maximum, 3.5 cubits, divine knowledge effectively closed to ordinary human awareness. This is not literary description. It is a table. The ratio is 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 across every variable: lifespan, physical stature, spiritual access, age length, applied consistently to each of the 4 yugas without exception. A mathematical structure this internally coherent does not emerge from successive authors embellishing mythology over centuries. It is either extracted from observation or calculated from a principle. American Vedic scholar David Frawley, in his 1990 work Gods, Sages, and Kings, documented that the Yuga cycle lengths align with actual astronomical cycles, specifically the precession of the equinoxes, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's rotational axis, divided according to the same 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 ratio. The mathematics are in the sky. They were there before anyone wrote the Puranas. The Bhagavata Purana is explicit about what drove the reduction. Not natural biological aging, not disease, not evolution. The text states directly that, as each yuga descends, divine sustaining energy is withdrawn, specifically the soma, described as the drink of the gods and the physical mechanism of extended longevity. When soma was accessible to humanity, humans lived 100,000 years. When access to soma was closed, the biological framework that sustained those lifespans collapsed, incrementally, 1 yuga at a time, by divine administration. The Vishnu Purana specifies soma as a physical substance possessed by the gods, accessible to humans in earlier ages through specific practices and divine favor, and progressively restricted as the cosmic cycle descended. In the Kali Yuga, now access is entirely closed. The texts record this not with grief, but with the clinical precision of a status report. What makes this impossible to file as myth is the medical text it generated. The Charaka Samhita, foundational Ayurvedic text with core content dating to approximately 600 BCE, opens its Rasayana chapter by asking why contemporary humans do not live as long as their ancestors, then proposes specific pharmacological and lifestyle protocols to partially recover lost longevity, names the substances, preparation methods, dosages, expected outcomes including lifespans extending to 1,000 years or more under ideal Rasayana conditions. A physician diagnosing the loss of longevity as a treatable clinical condition is not writing mythology. The Charaka Samhita is a medical textbook asking a medical question about a documented historical change. Why does the most ancient, continuously practiced medical tradition on Earth open with the question of why people no longer live as long as their ancestors? Why does the Yuga system's mathematical structure align with actual astronomical precession, cycles the Puranic authors could only have known through centuries of systematic sky observation? What is Soma, and why do texts separated by 1,000 years of Indian tradition consistently describe it as the physical mechanism of extended human longevity? And if the Kali Yuga ends as the texts calculate it, will what returns with the next Satya Yuga? The manuscripts are still being copied. The Saraswati River dried up. The calculation has not been revised. Number 4. The Epic of Gilgamesh. You're in the British Museum in London in 1872. A self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith, who began his career as a printer's apprentice and worked his way up to the museum's Assyrian Kal. By spending his lunch breaks reading cuneiform tablets, is going through crate contents from the Nineveh excavations when he stops. He recognizes the vocabulary on the fragment in his hand. A flood, a boat, animals, a survivor. He will recognize later that what he has found is a flood account centuries older than Genesis. He is also holding something more significant than a flood story. He is holding the world's oldest written investigation into where immortality went and who made sure it did not come back. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story on Earth. Its earliest fragments date to approximately 2100 BCE in Sumerian. The Akkadian version on the 12 tablets from Ashurbanipal's Nineveh library, the version Smith was reading, dates to approximately 700 BCE, but encodes a narrative tradition over 1,000 years older than that. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is described in the text as two-thirds divine, the last ruler of the post-flood world, to carry enough divine ancestry that mortality was genuinely an open question for him rather than simply an inheritance. His friend Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh, confronting mortality for what the text presents as essentially the first time, refuses to accept it. He sets out to find the one human the gods granted immortality after the flood. Utnapishtim. Here is what the epic actually says about immortality. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that after the flood, the gods convened to decide what to do with its survivors. The god Enki in Sumerian convinced the divine council to spare Utnapishtim and his wife. As a reward for surviving, the two were granted immortality directly. They live at the edge of the world, unchanged since the flood. Utnapishtim is not described as a god. He is a human being who was given what humans used to have and lost. Then, Utnapishtim reveals something else. At the bottom of the sea grows a plant. It restores youth. It is called the old man becomes young again. Its location, the method of descent, its physical description, all recorded on the tablet in specific terms. Gilgamesh dives for it, tying stones to his feet to reach the seafloor, retrieves it successfully, and plans to return to Uruk. He makes camp beside a pool of water. He sleeps. A serpent smells the plant, rises from the water, and takes it. The serpent sheds its skin and disappears. Andrew George, professor of Babylonianism at the University of London, in his 2003 critical edition of the Epic, the most comprehensive scholarly analysis ever published, notes that the text treats immortality not as a divine attribute, but as a substance that once existed in the physical world, was accessible to humans, and was specifically removed from human reach by a theft event. The plant grew at the bottom of the sea. It was real within the text's framework. It was retrieved. A serpent took it. Not from a divine vault, from a campsite, while a man slept. The theological statement appears earlier, on Tablet 10. The alewife Sidgeri, a minor deity who keeps a tavern at the edge of the world, tells Gilgamesh before he even reaches Utnapishtim. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. Present tense. The gods still have it. Death was allotted, distributed, assigned, given as a portion, a policy decision, and the gods retained the alternative. The epic's narrative structure makes clear this was not always the case. Gilgamesh's predecessor kings, as recorded in the Sumerian king list, ruled for tens of thousands of years. The text treats the progressive shortening of lifespan as recent enough that one man, Utnapishtim, still held the original version, and one plant at the bottom of the sea still carried the mechanism of restoration. Close. The serpent made it not close enough. What did the plant actually contain, and does anything at the floor of the ancient Persian Gulf still carry that chemistry? Why does the world's oldest written story treat immortality as a substance that was retrieved and then stolen, rather than as an abstract divine quality? Who sent the serpent? And why does this account carved into clay 2,000 years before Genesis describe a serpent at a body of water, taking something that would have given humanity eternal life? The tablets are in the British Museum. Smith found them during his lunch breaks. The serpent is still not accounted for. Number 5. The Atrahasis Epic. You're at the British Museum in London in 1965. Assyriologists Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard are finalizing the translation of tablets that have been in the museum's collections since the Nineveh excavations of the 19th century. The main tablet dates to approximately 1700 BCE. Fragments of related texts go back to 2600 BCE, making the core narrative older than any surviving version of Gilgamesh. When Lambert and Millard published their complete translation in 1969 under the title Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, what they give the world is the clearest ancient statement ever recorded about why humanity stopped living as long as it once did. The text does not present this as mythology. It presents it as minutes from a meeting. The Atrahasis Epic opens with a creation account. The god Enki engineers humanity from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain divine being, a hybrid, worker created to replace divine laborers exhausted from digging irrigation channels for the gods. The original humans are created without a death limit. The text does not describe a maximum lifespan. There is no mention of how long the first humans were supposed to live, because the question does not arise. They were made to work. They multiplied. They were loud. They had been alive too long, and there were too many of them, and the result was noise. This is the specific word the text uses. Noise. The god Enlil, chief administrator of the divine council, could not sleep. Humanity's population had grown beyond what the divine administration found tolerable. Enlil's complaint was not moral. He did not say humans had sinned or fallen short of divine expectations. He said there were too many of them, they were too loud, and they had been alive too long. Enlil's 3 interventions are documented in sequence. First, a plague, engineered with Enki's assistance, that reduced the human population and shortened the lives of those it did not kill outright. The humans prayed. The plague was lifted. The survivors were not restored to their original longevity. Second, a famine rain cut off, crops failed, starvation at population scale. Again the population fell. Again the survivors recovered, but were not restored. Third, the Great Flood, Enlil's final solution, intended to eliminate humanity entirely. What makes the Atrahasis account different from the Gilgamesh version of the same flood is what happens after it. In Gilgamesh, the aftermath centers on Utnapishtim's reward. In Atrahasis, the camera stays on the divine council. The gods debate. Enki, who saved humans by warning Atrahasis, argues that the population problem was never managed correctly, and that some humans were always going to survive. The debate is recorded. The resolution is documented. Scholar Tikva Frymerkensky, University of Chicago, published analysis in the journal Iraq in 1977, identifying this passage as the clearest ancient statement of divinely imposed mortality reduction in any known text. The solution agreed upon by the Council includes 3 specific mechanisms: a shortened human lifespan, hard-coded into human biology going forward; infant mortality, which had not previously existed; and conditions causing female infertility at a population scale rate. 3 separate biological interventions. 3 separate pathways. All agreed upon in Council. All implemented as administrative policy. This is not a story about death entering the world through human sin. The Atrahasis text is explicit. Humans did not sin. They were too loud and too numerous. The shortened lifespan was a governmental decision made by named divine entities to solve a population management problem. Death as humans currently experience it, specifically the compressed, biologically enforced death that limits human life to decades, was engineered after the flood by the same entities who engineered humans in the first place. The three-stage intervention maps with structural precision onto patterns across the other texts in this video. Plague reducing longevity. Famine selecting for shorter-lived survivors. Flood plus decree hard-coding the reduction. The Sumerian king list records the moment of change in one sentence. The Atrahasis Epic records the meeting at which the decision was made. Lambert and Millard established that the Atrahasis text predates and likely underlies both the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis account. It is the source document from which both later traditions drew. Why did the divine administration decide that humanity needed to die sooner, and why were three separate biological mechanisms required to enforce the decision? What were humans originally, before Enlil's three interventions, in terms of biological lifespan? Who was Enki arguing for in that council, and what compromise did he lose that he was not willing to put in writing? And who was in the room for that meeting that we do not know about, because the text records the outcome but not every voice that spoke? The tablets are in London. They have been saying this for 4,000 years. Number 6. The Book of Enoch. You're inside the monastery of Debre Damo in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia in 1768. The monastery sits on top of a flat-topped rock plateau. The only way in or out is a rope, lowered from the cliff edge when visitors are permitted. Scottish explorer James Bruce has climbed that rope. Inside, he finds 3 complete copies of a text that the rest of the world has not read in 1,400 years. The Book of Enoch. He carries the copies to Europe. The world eventually gets to read what was there. The most explicit ancient account of a divine decision to cap human lifespan at 120 years, the text that described that decision so directly, so specifically, that when the bishops of the early church convened in 364 CE, they voted to remove it from the Bible. No public explanation was recorded for the exclusion. 3 centuries of Christian use. Then silence. The Book of Enoch was considered scripture by the early Christian church for 3 centuries. The New Testament letter of Jude Canonical, undisputed, quotes it directly by name. The church father Tertullian referenced it as authoritative in the 2nd century CE. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE listed the acceptable books. The Book of Enoch was not on the list. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which developed its own canonical tradition independently after receiving Christianity in the 4th century, never removed it. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed the book's antiquity beyond challenge. Discovered at Qumran in 1947, the collection contained over 20 separate Enoch manuscript fragments, more copies than most canonical biblical books. The Qumran community, preserving these texts in the 1st century BCE, evidently considered Enoch among the most essential documents it held. The fragments are dated by paleography and radiocarbon analysis to between 250 BCE. This is not an Ethiopian medieval forgery. This is one of the most copied documents in the ancient Jewish world. Here is what the text records that made it inconvenient for Canon. The watchers the text uses the Hebrew Grigori, meaning those who watch are 200 divine beings who descended to earth and settled on Mount Hermon. They took human wives. They shared with humanity knowledge the divine administration had not authorized for human access. Metalworking, astronomy, herbalism, and this is the passage that drew the most scrutiny: medicines. The vocabulary the Book of Enoch uses for the medicines the Watchers shared is specific enough that scholar George Nicholsburg, University of Iowa, in his 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch, notes it uses vocabulary consistent with pharmacological knowledge, not folk tradition. Specific preparations, specific applications, knowledge that extended life. The divine response is documented in chapter 10. Bind Azazel, one of the leading watchers. Destroy the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the watchers and human women who carried the longevity of divine parentage. Confine the watchers for 70 generations. And then the passage the Council of Laodicea may have found most unsettling: the human lifespan is to be limited, not gradually, not naturally, by decree. 1 Enoch 10, verses 9 through 10. The word used in Ethiopic, which Richard Lawrence's 1821 translation renders as limiting their years, is a deliberate administrative term, a cap, announced and implemented as divine policy in direct response to the Watcher's unauthorized sharing of life-extending knowledge. Before the Watcher incident, the text describes no lifespan cap. Methuselah's 969 years is a normal biological fact of the pre-decree world. After the decree, 120 years is the ceiling. The same figure announced in Genesis 6, verse 3. Enoch himself is the most important data point. He is taken to heaven at 365 years, 1 year for each day of the solar year, a deliberate astronomical marker, without dying. He is shown the celestial machinery, the pillars of heaven, the names and stations of the stars, the complete structure of time. He does not return. The implication is not subtle. Enoch could have lived indefinitely. He was removed and given something else in exchange before the cap was applied to everyone else. The removal from the biblical canon in 364 CE is the most telling detail of all. 3 centuries of Christian use. The text quoted in the New Testament. The text preserved in the Qumran caves by Jews who considered it essential. Then one council meeting, no stated reason, and silence for 1400 years. Until a rope into an Ethiopian monastery brought it back. Why was the text that most explicitly describes the divine decree capping human lifespan the first one removed from Scripture? What medicines did the Watchers share that were specific enough to trigger a council-level response from the divine administration? What did Enoch see during his celestial tour that required his permanent removal from the world before the cap was enforced? And why did one church on one plateau in Ethiopia preserve what every other tradition suppressed? The 3 copies Bruce carried down the rope are in London, Oxford, and Paris. The rope at Deberdamo is still the only way in. Number 7. The Hebrew Genesis. You're inside the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo in 1896. Cambridge scholar Solomon Schechter has been given access to a storage room the Geniza sealed for centuries, containing 300,000 manuscript fragments, discarded sacred texts, stored rather than destroyed because Jewish law prohibits burning the name of God. Among them are some of the oldest surviving copies of the Genesis genealogies, the chapters that Western scholarship has most consistently treated as symbolic. What the fragments confirm is what the received Hebrew text has always stated. And when a physicist from MIT analyses what the Hebrew text states treating lifespan figures as data rather than metaphor, he finds a mathematical function. Not literary variation. A curve. The same curve as radioactive decay. The genealogy of Genesis 5 lists 10 predynastic patriarchs with their lifespans, precise to the year. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912. Enos, 905. Kenan, 910. Mahalalel, 895. Jared, 962. Enoch, 365, then taken without dying. Methuselah, 969, the oldest human lifespan recorded in any ancient text. Lamech, 777. Noah, 950. For each, the text gives the age at the birth of the named son and the total lifespan. The scribal precision is identical to what the same textual tradition uses for legal records and property transactions. Not one figure is approximate. After the flood, the text continues with the same precision. Shem, 600. Arphaxad, 438. Shelah, 433.
Ebba,
464. Peleg, 239. Ru, 239. Serug, 230. Nahor, 148. Terah, 205. Abraham, 175. Isaac, 180. Jacob, 147. Joseph, 110. Across 13 post-flood generations, the maximum human lifespan drops from 950 to 110, an 88.6% reduction, not linear, not random. Gerald Schroeder, who holds a doctorate in physics from MIT and whose work has been published in Geophysical Research Letters, analyzed the post-flood lifespan curve in his 1990 work Genesis and the Big Bang. His finding: the curve follows a logarithmic decay function. The same mathematical shape as radioactive decay, a system that begins at a high value and degrades at a rate proportional to its current level, producing a curve that drops steeply at first and then flattens. Schroeder's analysis showed that the Genesis lifespan data, plotted against generation number, fits this function with statistical precision inconsistent with literary invention. Real data clusters around a function. Made-up numbers scatter. These cluster. Here is what makes this finding impossible to dismiss. 3 completely independent textual traditions preserve the Genesis genealogy. The Masoretic text, the received Hebrew Bible, used by most modern translations. The Septuagint, the Greek translation produced around 270 BCE. And the Samaritan Pentateuch, maintained by the Samaritan community in complete isolation from mainstream Judaism for over 2,000 years. All 3 give different specific numbers for individual patriarchs. The Septuagint differs from the Masoretic on multiple figures. The Samaritan Pentateuch differs from both. 3 separate manuscripts. Different data points on every line. Same logarithmic decay curve when graphed. 3 independent traditions, different numbers, same mathematical function. That is not coincidence. That is a documented phenomenon preserved across separate cultural lines. The text names the mechanism. Genesis 6, verse 3, placed immediately before the flood narrative. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, in their going astray they are flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. The announcement of the cap, the same 120-year figure specified as a divine Sanmon and 20-year figure, specified as a divine Ba, decree in the Book of Enoch, and approached asymptotically in the Genesis genealogy's own declining curve. The text frames this as a limitation applied from outside, not natural biology, not evolutionary change, a decision. Genesis 6 verse 4 follows immediately. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The long-lived population and the physically exceptional population appear in the same sentence. They disappear together at the flood. What replaces them is a declining version of what came before, mathematically documented across 13 generations until the curve reaches modern human biological ranges. Why do 3 independent ancient textual traditions with different specific numbers for Panarau? Each patriarch produced the same logarithmic decay curve for post-flood human lifespans. Why does the curve follow the same mathematical function as radioactive decay, a natural physical process governed by unchanging physical constants? What was the mechanism of the 120-year cap? And why does the curve approach that figure without quite reaching it until Joseph, 13 generations after the flood? And what was different about human biology before the flood that sustained Methuselah at 969 years, and what changed, specifically, in his descendants that made each generation shorter? The manuscripts are in Cambridge, Oxford, Jerusalem, and Nablus. They all report the same thing. The numbers disagree. The curve does not. Number 8. The Mahabharata. You're on the banks of the Saraswati River in what is now northwestern India in 3000 BCE. The river, which will dry up entirely by 1900 BCE, leaving a dry riverbed that satellite imagery will map in the 20th century, is running wide and full. Along its banks, scholars are maintaining through strict oral transmission a body of knowledge that will not be committed to writing for another 2,000 years. What they are preserving is not myth in the way a modern reader understands the word. It is an account of where immortality came from, who produced it, who kept it, and why the people standing beside this river are shorter-lived than the people who came before them. The account is explicit. The names are given. The process is described. The outcome is recorded. The Mahabharata completed in written form around 400 BCE, but in coding traditions the text, attributes to the 3rd millennium BCE, is the world's longest literary work at over 1.8 million words. Its Adi Parva, the first book, contains the event that defines the human condition in this tradition. The Samudra Manthan, the churning of the cosmic ocean. The gods, the Devas, and the anti-gods, the Asuras, work together, using the cosmic serpent Vasuki as a rope and Mount Mandara as a churning rod, to agitate the primordial ocean. From the ocean, over the course of the churning, emerge 14 divine treasures. The 14th and final treasure is the Amrita, the nectar of immortality, liquid, physical, a substance that can be consumed. Here is what happens. Both the Devas and the Asuras reach for the Amrita. The god Vishnu, appearing in the form of the enchantress Mohini, distributes the Amrita to the Devas, while the Asuras are distracted. The Devas drink it. The Asuras receive nothing. Humans are not in the account at all. The question of human access to the Amrita does not arise because humans were not present when it was distributed. The text records this, not as tragedy, but as the natural order. Immortality was available in the physical universe. It was produced through specific effort. It was kept. The Mahabharata is explicit that this was not always the human condition. The Shanti Parva, the 12th of the 18 major books, the Book of Peace, contains a direct inquiry on this question. King Yudhishthira asks a divine being why human lifespans are so short in the present age. The answer references the Kali Yuga framework. The channels through which divine sustaining energy once reached humanity have closed. The lifespan reduction is not biological evolution. It is the closing of a supply line. Adjacent to this framework is the medical text that treated the supply line problem as a clinical challenge. The Charaka Samhita core content, dating to approximately 600 BCE, devotes its entire Rasayana chapter to recovering lost human longevity. The opening of that chapter states that ancient humans lived to 1,000 years or more under proper conditions. It names substances, preparation methods, quantities, expected outcomes. Indian scientist B.G. Madhaprkar, reporting in the journal Current Science in 2002, proposed that specific Rasayana preparations described in the Charaka Samhita align in their described mechanisms of tissue renewal with principles of stem cell activation as understood by contemporary biology. The passages use vocabulary that, in translation, describes what would now be called cellular rejuvenation. A medical tradition does not write a clinical protocol for reversing a mythological condition. The Charaka Samhita was written for practitioners who expected results. It references the same reduction the Mahabharata records as historical and asks what medicine can do about it. The answer is not symbolic. Two documents from the same civilization. One describing immortality as a physical substance produced from the universe and kept by divine beings. The other describing the shortened human lifespan that followed as a clinical problem amenable to pharmacological solution. The second document could only have been written by someone who took the first as documented history. What exactly is the Amrita, and does the mechanism by which it was produced from the primordial ocean encode a physical or chemical process that can be understood? Who decided that humans would not be present when it was distributed? Why does the most ancient, continuously practiced medical tradition on Earth treat shortened human lifespan as a reversible pharmacological problem rather than a natural biological fact? And if the Rasayana protocols can partially recover what was lost, what would the full version look like, and who decided humanity should not have access to it? The Saraswati River is gone. The texts it generated are in every library on Earth. The question has never been formally closed. Number 9. The Palermo Stone. You're at the Palermo Archaeological Museum in Sicily in 1877. A fragment of black basalt roughly 24 inches tall, 44 inches wide, is being catalogued. It arrived from Egypt, where it was purchased in 1859. It arrived in pieces, not because it crumbled during transport, because it was already in pieces when it was found. The fracture points are clean, consistent. The kind of breaks produced by deliberate force applied at specific locations, not by age or accidental impact. Someone broke this stone. Someone wanted it in pieces. And what the stone records an administrative history of Egyptian rule going back tens of thousands of years before the first human pharaoh, with reign lengths far exceeding anything human biology can account for, suggests why. The Palermo Stone is the oldest known Egyptian administrative record. Carved during the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, it encodes records maintained across hundreds of years of Egyptian history. Across its surviving face, in horizontal rows, are the annual records of Egyptian rulers. The name of each year, the height of the Nile flood for that year, significant events, and the ruler whose reign it fell under. Working backward from the historical pharaohs whose names appear on excavated monuments, the stone enters territory the standard timeline cannot account for. The upper rows record rulers the Egyptian scribes identified as predating all human pharaohs. These correspond to the beings named in the Turin royal canon as the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, and to the divine kings Manetho, independently described in his Egyptiaca around 285 BCE. Their reign lengths are recorded in the same column format as the historical pharaohs below them. Flinders Petrie, the British Egyptologist who built the discipline of systematic archaeological method in Egypt, published his analysis in 1916. His conclusion: the reign lengths encoded in the predynastic rows are inconsistent with human biological limits. Individually, they range from 120 to over 1,200 years per ruler. He noted this as a fact. He did not know what to do with it. Alan Gardner, in Egypt of the Pharaohs, published in 1961, confirmed what Petrie had documented. The The scribes who carved the Palermo Stone used no special notation to distinguish pre-dynastic divine entries from historical ones. No category header, no scribble note, no formatting difference marking the followers of Horus as a different type of record from Narmer or Den. To the 5th dynasty scribes, professional administrators trained in the distinction between sacred texts and administrative records, the pre-dynastic divine rulers were historical predecessors. The same column, the same weight of evidence. We possess approximately 40% of the original stone. 5 fragments survive. The main slab is in Palermo. 2 fragments are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. 2 more are in the Petrie Museum at University College London. A central section which, by the geometry of the surviving pieces, would have covered the full pre-dynastic king list, including the spirits of the dead who preceded even the followers of Horus, is missing. Not damaged beyond reading. Not crumbled. Missing. Its last described location is consistent with a piece that was deliberately removed rather than one that crumbled in place. The Demotic Chronicle, preserved as Papyrus 215 in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, dating to the 3rd century BCE, independently references the same pre-dynastic divine rulership era with comparable reign lengths. 2 administrative documents, produced 9 centuries apart from entirely separate archival traditions, record the same pre-human rulers with the same characteristics. The transition on the surviving Palermo stone is the most important feature it contains. At the row where the last follower of Horus gives way to the first confirmed human pharaoh Narmer, 1st dynasty, approximately 3100 BCE, the reign lengths change character and never change back. Not gradually. Between one horizontal row and the next, the rulers of Egypt stopped living the way they had lived for the previous 36,000 years. The stone records the transition without comment. No explanation. No note on what ended. Just the column header, and a different kind of number on the other side. Who broke the Palermo stone, and did the missing central section contain the complete pre-dynastic divine reign list that would have made the case unanswerable? Why do 2 Egyptian administrative documents, produced 9 centuries apart, independently, record pre-human rulers with superhuman reign lengths in the same administrative format? What mechanism sustained the followers of Horus across centuries of unbroken rule? And what ended it at the exact moment the first human pharaoh took the throne? And why is the one piece that would answer these questions the one piece that cannot be found? The 4 existing fragments are distributed across 3 countries. The 5th has not been located. Number 10. The Popol Vuh. You're in the town of Chichicastenango in the highlands of Guatemala in 1701. Dominican friar Francisco Ximenez, serving as parish priest for the local Quiche Maya community, has been given access to a manuscript his parishioners have kept hidden since the Spanish conquest a century and a half earlier. Written on European paper in the Latin alphabet missionaries introduced after 1519, but encoding oral traditions that extend back thousands of years. The Quiche community had committed their sacred knowledge to writing around 1550 CE, specifically because the Spanish were burning every Maya book they could find. Bishop Diego de Landa had already done exactly that in the town of Mani in 1562 one bonfire. Virtually the entire written corpus of Maya civilization, centuries of knowledge on bark paper and deer hide, gone in an afternoon. One community in one highland town had hidden one manuscript. Jimenez transcribed it. His transcription is now in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The original has not been seen since the transcription was made. This text survived by a margin so thin that the information it contains should not exist. What it contains is the most explicit statement in any ancient document about why humanity is not what it was originally designed to be. The Popol Vuh describes multiple attempts by the divine creators to produce humanity. Mud humans dissolved in water. Wood humans could speak, but had no memory, no blood, no understanding. The gods destroyed them in a flood. The 3rd attempt used white corn and yellow corn ground into dough, fashioned into 4 men: Balamkitsi, Balamakab, Mahukuta, and Equibilim. The text says these 4 men were perfect. Then it describes what perfect meant, and why it was a problem. Here is what the Popol Vuh records. The first 4 humans could see everything. They saw too much. Their wisdom reached to the sky. Their sight was too far. They understood everything that existed in the world. They saw all 4 corners, all 4 angles of the dome of the sky and the flat face of the earth, and everything between. Not metaphors for intelligence. The text describes the first humans perceiving the entire structure of the cosmos without obstruction, at the level of the divine creators themselves. Then the divine creators realized what they had made. The gods convened a council. The text names who was in the room: the maker, the modeler, the bearer, the begetter, Hunapupasam, Hunapukioti, Expiakak, Exmukane, the sovereign, the plumed serpent. All present, all deliberating. The conclusion was unanimous and is recorded verbatim. What our works and designs have seen must be stopped. It is not right that the creatures we have made should know everything equally with us. Adrian Recinos, whose 1950 Spanish translation and Delia Goetz's 1953 English edition became the definitive scholarly versions, noted that this episode is not treated by the KH as metaphor. It is the literal event that produced the current human condition. Michael Coe, Yale University anthropologist, identified it in his 1993 analysis as the most direct ancient statement of deliberate human capability reduction in any known pre-Columbian text. The intervention followed immediately. The sovereign plumed serpent breathed fog across the eyes of the four first humans. They were blinded as the face of a mirror is breathed upon. Their perfect sight was clouded. Their direct access to divine knowledge was dimmed. Their indefinite lifespan implied by their complete, unobstructed existence was curtailed. The first four humans, who could see everything the gods could see, became the ancestors of beings who cannot. The first four men are described throughout the subsequent text as the grandfathers of the Kiche, distinct category of being that no longer exists. Not mythological ancestors. A different type of human, present before the fog was applied. What the Quiche call their grandfathers, the rest of the ancient world calls the pre-Diluvian generations, the long-lived. The ones whose lifespans the Sumerian king list recorded in administrative columns, and the Turin Canon recorded in the same format as Ramesses II's own reign. 10 scripts, 5 continents, 5,000 years of documentation. Every single one records the same event from a different angle. In Sumar, 8 kings ruled for 241,200 combined years before a flood ended that age. In Egypt, divine rulers governed for 36,000 years before human pharaohs took over in decades. In India, a mathematical system tracks the withdrawal of the Soma and the collapse of 100,000-year lifespans through 4 descending ages. In Babylon, the world's oldest story names the plant that could restore immortality and the serpent that stole it. A Babylonian text older than Gilgamesh records the divine council meeting at which shortened human lifespan was voted into existence. The Book of Enoch records the 120-year cap as a specific divine decree then was removed from the Bible. The Genesis genealogy documents the post-flood decline in a curve a physicist identified as logarithmic decay. The Mahabharata describes immortality as a physical substance produced from the universe, distributed to the gods, and withheld from humanity. The Palermo Stone records centuries-long pre-human reigns in administrative columns, and someone broke the stone. And the Popol Vuh records a divine council voting unanimously to fog human perception and cut short human life. 10 records. 1 event. Something was taken from us. The scripts have been saying so since the first clay was pressed. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Like if you think humanity was handed a shorter life than it was originally meant to live. And drop a comment below where in the world are you watching from.